Hey, so welcome back to class. Today, we are talking about critical race theory. Hold on for a quick second. All right, so welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about critical race theory and talk a little bit about intersectionality with this lecture. All right. First thing we're going to do is first, this idea of critical race theory is something that has come into the forefront in the mainstream in maybe the past year or two, and it has become more popular in terms of its conversation. It has also started to become more controversial. Critical race theory has always been controversial, but now it's starting to become even more controversial in terms of how it is discussed and how it is taught, not just to students of color and people of color, but to white students. So now it is said to be something that is poisoning our kids, or is something that is making people feel bad about themselves or feel bad about their people and things like that. So I think it's important for us to have an open and honest dialogue about critical race theory, exactly what it is, and then lead us to then create some intelligent and forward-thinking discussion on exactly what critical race theory is and how it can be used to help us make sense of the realities of the racialized happenings of our society, right? So, first question is, so the question is, what do people believe critical race theory is? So I want you to click on this link right here in the PowerPoint. I want you to watch this clip about what people believe critical race theory is. And then I want you to come back to this lecture and we'll have a further discussion. Okay. So, what is critical race theory? Right? We see what some people are saying it is. Sorry, I have to pause again. So what is critical race theory? Some of the things that people are saying critical race theory is, or some of the assumptions that people have. I want to make sure that we address those first, right? So one assumption, right, that white people are evil, white people are bad people, right? Many people believe that critical race theory is saying that white people are bad or white people are evil, or that white people are the reason why things are negative in our society, right? And that is not what critical race theory is saying, okay? So that's one thing that's important for us to recognize, is that critical race theory is not saying that white people are bad or that white people are evil, right? Another thing is that it is not saying that minorities should oppress other groups. So there is not this belief that, well, since certain minority groups have been oppressed in certain ways, then they should be able to exact revenge on the majority group and oppress them. It is not saying that, and it is not saying that minority people should hold any type of dominance over any other group. Some people think that critical race theory is an anti-American theory, and it is not. It is not saying that a person should hate America. It is not a theory that preaches anti-America or anti-whiteness. Then it is, some people believe that critical race theory teaches white people to hate themselves. And that is not the case. This theory was not put in place to get white people to hate themselves or to hate being white, right? It is not to wish that someone would self-deprecate or have a negative image of their own personal selves, right? So those are some of the things that I think I wanted to kind of say first, right? Before we go into what critical race theory actually is and the purpose of critical race theory. Now, there are other theories and there are other ideas and there are other concepts that some of these assumptions may be more in line with. And in maybe a larger race course, or if this was a race course that extended a couple of semesters, because you can do a whole year on just race, we could probably talk about some of those theories. But critical race theory is not one of them, right? The attack on the Black Lives Matter protests is really protest in, I believe it was 2020, is really what has kind of gave rise to this new and not improved, but this new kind of fascination with critical race theory, right? Because many people are asking themselves the question, well, I'll say this. Going back to, let's see, the Black Lives Matter protests started. Some of you are maybe too young to remember when all of that started, but I'm not. I'm old, a lot older than than some of you all are. But if you recall the Trayvon Martin shooting, I believe it was in 2010, 2011, something like that, early 2010s. Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman. And the lack of justice, not just the murder, but the lack of justice around the murder, sparked protests all over the world. And that wasn't the first one, and it wasn't the last one. There was the killing of Oscar Grant. There was the killing of Sean Bell. There was the Jenna 6. There were so many things that led up to why people were so upset when Trayvon Martin died and George Zimmerman was not arrested. And I believe it was that case, it was that really kind of sparked the protests that began to later on be characterized as Black Lives Matter protests, because I want to say it was at those protests that you started to hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, and the hashtag Black Lives Matter became extremely popular. And then, of course, you had what was the gentleman in Ferguson, Mike Brown, and a couple of other young men who died, who were killed, either by the hands of the police, law enforcement, or by white vigilantes. And as more and more of these killings started to occur, these protests started to happen, which led to Black Lives Matter being an entire movement, right? Now, and I remember being a part of this. I'm in my 20s. And pretty much everybody at those protests were all Black, right? Black, or maybe Latinx, right? But very, very, very few white people. Maybe like a couple of white liberals. But for the most part, wasn't too many white people at these protests in the early 2010s, especially because Black Lives Matter was seen as a hate group. It was seen as a group that was agitating the public, a group that was seen as trying to be anti-police, a group that was seen as an angry group of young African Americans who don't understand the importance of law. So this is what Black Lives Matter was all the way up until maybe the latter part of the 2010s and up until 2020 with the killing of George Floyd. And it was at the killing of George Floyd that we saw a different demographic, not a different demographic, but a demographic presentation that was much different than how it was when the Black Lives Matter protests first started. Because now when you see these protests, they are largely white. There are lots of white people at these protests. And with the onset of mainstream, with the onset of the larger population, when we say a larger population, that generally just means white people. When you see white people now attaching themselves to a movement, to a protest call, now this is when larger systems, this is when the government, this is when larger powers at play begin to question, okay, what's going on here? We don't mind minority groups getting together, complaining, organizing, marching, protesting. We get it. They're going to do it. They're always going to do it. But now we have white people, particularly young white people, who are now wanting to join in these movements. Why? What's going on? What now? Now they're recruiting white folks. Now they're recruiting mainstream. Now they're recruiting popular culture. Why? What's happening? What's causing them to want to join this movement? And what people suggested was that it was this teaching of critical race theory in the college classroom. They believe that, oh, it's in these classrooms that young white students are being taught these ideas around race, that they're being taught by these professors, whether they're professors of color or white professors, that are teaching them about race in this different way. And it is making them want to align themselves with groups like Black Lives Matter. And it is making this protest, and it is making this movement that much more powerful. And so now we have to figure out what we can do. We'll come back to that. So I want to jump to this next slide and this quote is a quote by one of my former professors. Her name is Dr. Ifeoma Kwesi. She's a mentor of mine. She was one of my professors in undergrad. And one thing she told me, and I was I studied religion, so I was a religion student. And she was talking more so about the church, right? She was talking about the church as a religious institution and a social institution. And what she suggested was that you can't be an uncritical lover nor an unloving critic of something that you care about. Right. I took that and I applied that to my everyday life. I apply that particularly to society. And what I would suggest is that we can also use this and apply the same concept to the country in which we live. You can't be an uncritical lover nor an unloving critic of something that you care about. To be an uncritical lover is to love something or someone without ever criticizing it, without ever calling it out if it does something wrong, right? That's an uncritical lover. Everything the lover does is correct. So let's personify this a little bit. Let's say one thing most of us have in common, everybody probably wants to or likes romantic love, romantic relationships, friendships, whatever, but likes to be loved or likes to be in a loving situation, right? So if you are in love or you love somebody, just because you criticize that person or just because you call that person out doesn't mean you don't love them. In fact, it means you do love them because you want to see them do the best, right? And be the best. Nor are you called to be an unloving critic. So just because You criticize somebody, or just because you love somebody doesn't mean you can just criticize them in any way. If you criticize someone, you should criticize them in love. In fact, if a person that does not love you criticizes you, you may not take it well. You may take offense to it. But if someone who does love you, let's say your parents or your boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife or friend, criticizes you and tells you that you've done something wrong and you should fix it or whatever, you may consider it because you know that this person loves you. So criticizing someone without the love is being an unloving critic, and loving somebody without criticizing them or without telling them when they're wrong is being an uncritical lover. And neither one of these are correct. So if you love somebody or if you love something, then you can't be an uncritical lover, nor can you be an unloving critic. This same idea can be applied to the country in which we live. Many people claim to love the United States of America. I love America, America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, such and such. Blah, blah, blah. Well, if a person loves America and everything that it stands for and all of its principles, then they should not be an uncritical lover, meaning I can look at this country and I can say this country is great and it's wonderful and there's nothing wrong and America's perfect. Always been perfect, always will be perfect. Nothing to criticize about the United States. It's being an uncritical lover, and it's false. Nor should you be an unloving critic. So if you're going to criticize, or if a person really does love something or love this country, then they should be open to criticizing the country and calling the country out for its wrongs in the past and in the present day. And this is what critical race theory does. Critical race theory says, I am not going to be an uncritical lover, nor am I going to be an unloving critic, but I'm going to be honest about what this country has done to people of color. And I'm going to be honest about ways in which we can not only really truly address our racial past, but also find ways to heal from that racial past, both the victims and the victors of our racial past, and hopefully move on and not repeat those same mistakes in the future. Critical race theory is a specific set of principles and theories that actively engage general racial theories of particular times and or social content. So within critical race theory, there are other theories that we talk about, right? We talk about Black People's Thought, talk about intersectionality, talk about systemic racism theory, like all the consciousness, all of these things kind of fall under critical race theory. Along with class and gender, studying race completes the main sets of three oppressed social groups. The sociological triad that we tend to study in this discipline: race, class, and gender, right? So critical race theory is just a theory that helps us to assess and delineate and helps us to understand deeper the complexities of race. All right, so critical race theory was developed out of legal scholarship, and it provides a critical analysis of race and racism from a legal point of view. Before we get into these basic tenets, just want to talk to you a little bit about the history of critical race theory. So critical race theory started, well, let me paint a picture for you. Social context, or historical context. Let's take us back to, let's say, the 70s, 1970s, okay? So you have the 1970s post-civil rights. More and more opportunities are being available to African Americans. African Americans are now able to attend predominantly white schools in numbers that are unprecedented. more and more African Americans are able to move into predominantly white neighborhoods, where before they were not allowed to do that. And so the Black middle class is expanding. Okay. You have a couple of young African Americans who are now entering law school in the 1970s. And this is what they're being taught, that race and racism is an issue in America. They're being taught the honest truths about the history of race in America. However, the idea is that the law is the great equalizer, meaning the American justice system has been set up to be colorblind. The American justice system does not see race. The American justice system is the place where no matter what color you are, no matter what your gender, no matter what your class status, once you appear in front of the justice system, once you appear in front of a judge, once you appear in front of the court of law, no one cares about your color. No one cares about your gender. No one cares about your sexual identity. The only thing that matters is, did you break the law or did you not? If you did, you're punished, and if you did not, then you're free. So this idea that the law is the great equalizer and that racism is an historical issue and a contemporary issue, but in front of the law, that's done away with, was something that these young minority law students didn't understand, because they're saying to themselves, that's not what we've experienced. That's not what we've seen. Racism does not stop at the law. In fact, the law very much reinforces racism. And we've seen it with our parents or our brothers or sisters or friends or people in our community. So, and historically, the law has been a huge purveyor of racism. So these young people said, okay, well, we're going to finish law school. And they graduated from some of the top law schools, UCLA, Princeton, Harvard, went on to become lawyers, went on to become law professors. And then in the 1980s, they said, now we're going to change the dialogue. We're going to publish papers. We're going to change the dialogue. We're going to change what is being said about race and come up with a theoretical framework that future lawyers can use to help make sense of and dialogue about race. So they begin to publish papers in the 1980s on the topic of race. And they call these studies and they call these concepts and these ideas around some of the more accurate understandings of race from the perspective of people of color and minority groups, critical race theory. And these are some of the basic tenets that begin to guide this framework that they created. And when I say these people, I'm talking about people like Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a professor out of UCLA. You're going to hear from her in a second. Richard Delgado, I want to say he came out of Harvard. Another person, he was actually Barack Obama's law professor. What was his name? He wrote, was it Afro-Atlantica? Oh, Derek Bell. That's what it was. I was getting ready to look it up. Well, his name is Derek Bell. He was a professor at Harvard. He was President Obama's law professor, and he's also one of the gentlemen who, one of the founders of critical race theory. All right. So, among many others, right? So 4 points, 4 basic tenets that guide critical race theory. 1, critical race theory says that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society, right? That it is a part of the foundation of the United States. And you don't have to read any legal framework or legal studies to know that. All you have to do is read a high school or middle school history book. You see how slavery helped to create the United States, to see how the native, called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, or many of the other actions taken by U.S. citizens and U.S. leaders of the past, helped to create the country in which we live. So clearly, racism is something that is a part of American society. It helped to create our modern day America. Not only that, but you can also see some of the institutions as well as many of the laws that were written and created to help build on our current judicial system. These laws are very much racist. So racism is a part of the fabric and system of the American society. Second, the individual races need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. Most people will say, well, racism doesn't exist because I don't know anyone who's racist. Or, well, if we can stop all these people from being racist, then that can stop racism from existing. Critical race theory says, no, it doesn't matter necessarily what an individual does. It would be nice if individuals would not be racist. That would be wonderful. All right, and that could definitely help. But it's not about the individual as much as it is about a system of racial oppression that has existed and continues to exist, so that even with people who are not racist, these things still come up. When many people talk about the misbehaving, or I forgot the term is slipping me, but in situations where law enforcement are not doing what they're supposed to do, and you have police killings or you have police brutality, and people ask the question, man, why does this keep happening? But there are good cops out there. Well, I believe it, and I think a lot of people do believe that there are good cops out there, and there are good people who also become cops. But it's not just about good people or good cops or bad cops. It's not that simple. It is about the system of policing. If you date the research all the way back to the middle to the latter part of the 19th century, to the very first police precinct or modern day police system in Boston, if you look at the history of policing, it has its foundations in slave catchers. So the very first police officers were people who were hired to catch African people who were running to freedom. These people later on began to form the Boston Police, the Boston Police Department, which, if I recall, is the first police department in the United States. And then from there, that begins to spread. And if you look at early police officers, or like the early FBI, their goal was to undermine Black resistance efforts. Their goal was to undermine efforts to unify people across racial groups, or to undermine efforts that Black people, specifically Black people and other people of color, had to seek freedom and equality. So all of this is a part of the system. So with that being part of the system, whether you have a person that is good or that is bad or that is right or wrong or racist or anti-racist, being anti-racist is great, but it doesn't really do much if the system itself is racist, which is what critical race theory argues. Critical race theory also argues that power structures are based on white privilege or white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color, meaning the power structure that exists within our society, our government, our legal system, law enforcement, the medical industry, education system, all of these things are put in place to help white people. Every system that we have in our society is created to help white people. It is not created to help other people. Now, does not mean that other people of color have not been able to work within these systems and become successful. Sure, you have professors of color, you have presidents of color, you have CEOs of color, you have all of these examples, you have millionaires, billionaires, blah, blah, blah. But one thing about it is that it's extremely disproportionate in terms of race. And number two, it still does not mean that the structure itself was created to assist those people in their mobility as well as white people. So just because some people of color have been able to integrate these systems and become successful does not mean that the power structure itself was created for them. And then lastly, critical race theory rejects traditions of liberalism and meritocracy. So it rejects this idea that people are successful solely based on their merits, meaning that you are not successful solely because you did all the right things. Now, does not mean merit should be taken away. Just because a person has privilege does not necessarily mean that they didn't work hard. It just does not mean that they became successful solely based on their merit. If we were to take race out of this equation just for a quick second and just talk about gender, then I can look at myself and I can say that whatever success I have achieved, I can say some of it has been due to merit and working hard. But also, I understand that I have had a gender privilege that many of my women colleagues, whether white women colleagues or black women colleagues or other women of color colleagues, have not had. There are ways in which I've been able to navigate academia and I've been able to negotiate positions in academia that many of my women counterparts have not been able to do. It doesn't take away from the work that I put in, but I also have to recognize that. And then in recognizing that privilege, say, now that I recognize that, and now that I've rejected this idea of meritocracy, that everything is based on just my personal hard work, then I can say, well, this exists. Now, how do we go about stopping this from continuing? Okay. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Critical race theory, purpose. So what are the purposes of critical race theory? Well, number one, critical race theory is put in place to advance social justice ideas. So ideas around social justice, ideas around equality, ideas around fairness and equity. These are ideas that critical race theory has been put in place to help move forward. An agenda to help move forward, an agenda of social justice, propriety, and fairness. Critical race theory aims to even out social inequalities. So the social inequalities, the wealth disparities, the educational disparities, the unequal opportunity to housing, unequal opportunity to employment, underemployment, the poverty rate, the racialized poverty rate, all of these things, critical race theory says we want to even out these inequalities so they do not exist. Doesn't mean poverty won't exist. Doesn't mean some people won't be rich and some people won't be poor. It just means that they should not be so unequal along racial lines. One of the purposes of critical race theory, another, is that it studies the intersections between different groups of minorities. So critical race theory doesn't just look at one race, or it doesn't just look at race, but critical race theory looks at race, but also how gender plays into race, how sexual identity plays into race, how religion plays into race, how educational status plays into race. So it looks at these intersectionalities, which is something we're going to talk about later. Another purpose is that critical race theory studies the significance of mass media and popular culture in the distribution of power and the perception of minorities. So it looks at not only race and racial perspectives and stereotypes, but what is playing into these stereotypes. What are movies saying? What are TV shows saying? What is the media saying? What are the news stations saying? What is the music saying? What are popular political pundits saying? And how is this shaping how power is distributed, and how is this shaping how people think about minorities? Okay. Okay. So, a couple questions to focus on. When we think about critical race theory, or actually, no, not when we think about critical race theory, when you find something and how you know you're actually kind of thinking along critical race theoretical line, these are some of the questions you want to ask yourself. Is this good for people of color? We don't say colored people. I've been seeing this in some of your papers. Please don't say colored people. Saying colored people is not the correct language. It is not the correct thing to call a Black person or any other non-white person. But people of color is good. So when you watch something that has racial overtones, racial overtones, ask yourself this question: is this good for people of color? How does this portray people of color? What conclusions seem to be made about people of color? And what intersectionalities, so race or race plus gender or class, or gender and or class and or ethnicity and or sexuality and or etc., can you find, and what do they mean? So these are 4 questions that are good ways to help us think about an idea, a display, a show, a YouTube clip, a commercial, a book, anything from a critical race theoretical perspective. Right? So let's look at this. This next slide. So we see this advertisement from the 1920s. Okay. And it looks like it's an advertisement for, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it's for. But we see it looks like there's a baby with a bow. So I'm assuming it's a girl. And this baby who's very, very dark with big lips, big eyes, is eating a watermelon. Okay. And it says pickaninny, okay, which is a derogatory term for a young Black child. And we're looking at this ad, a real life ad from the 1920s. So now let's ask ourselves these 4 questions brought to us to help us think critically about this racialized advertisement. Is this good for people of color? We don't say color people, so we say people of color. Is this a good thing, display for people of color? Doesn't look like it. How does this portray people of color? Well, it's saying that they have big lips, they're extremely dark, that they're eating a watermelon, they have this hair that looks weird. It's basically portraying them as a caricature. This very ignorant, entertaining object, or an object for white people's entertainment and white people's pity. What conclusions seem to be made about people of color? The conclusions made here are that Black people specifically are, I don't know, funny, I guess. Again, they like to eat watermelon. They're ugly. Calling them a pickaninny, which means, again, they're young, they're uneducated, they're aloof, they're uncivilized. These are some of the conclusions that can be made by what is being said and what is being shown in this advertisement. And what intersectionalities can you find, and what do they mean? So you see this is a Black, supposed to be a Black person, maybe a Black girl. So this is also saying something about young Black girls. Again, ugly, Hair is growing kind of all over the place. And does not look well kept. So this basically gives off a very negative view of African American people, right? Very negative view of African American people. Let me look at this. Now, let's try and add that's a little bit more modern to the next slide. Because we can look at that and say, well, Professor Gray, you're right about all of that. I understand that wholeheartedly. But we also have to keep in mind that was the 1920s, and I mean, most everybody was racist. All right, racism was the law of the land. This was right towards the beginnings of legal segregation. And so seeing a racist ad is not surprising for something in the 1920s. You're right. So then let's look at a much more recent advertisement. I want you to click this link and then come back and we're going to talk about it. So looking at this much more recent advertisement, is this good for people of color? Don't say colored people. Obviously not. Doesn't look like it's good. And even if you're a white person and you're like, well, I don't know if it's good for people of color. I'm not a person of color. I can't say. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Okay. You can ask, and obviously people of color are not a monolith, so some people may look at something and say they don't care. Other people may look at something and say, I do care, whatever. But these other questions can help bring us some clarity. How does this portray people of color? Doesn't portray them in a positive light. It makes them feel as if their color is not attractive, as if they're not attractive. And because they're not attractive, they can't achieve a certain level of success and mobility. So, but if they change their color, if they change their race, if they're lighter, the closer they are to white, the better they will be. Which, in society, and in some ways, that's very true. There is a lighter skin to a white privilege. But this makes it seem as though that color, a darker color, is bad. What conclusions seem to be made about people of color? That the way to being successful is to lighten one's skin. Lighten your skin, you'll be okay. You're the problem, so you need to find a way to fix this problem. As opposed to fixing a society so that a person's darkness or lightness has no bearing on if they are successful or not. And what intersectionalities can we see? I mean, clearly there's race, there's gender, there's attractiveness, sexuality there, all intertwined. All kinds of conversations there, right? The young lady feels better. She feels prettier because now she's lighter. There's a class economics there because now she has the job or she's able to do what she needs to do. Why? Because she changed her race. So you have race, you have gender, you have class, you have sexuality, attractiveness, all of that all intertwined. This is a kind of way in which we can use these questions to help us think much more critically about the notion of race. So critical race theory, again, and this is kind of just to give us an overall view, critical race theory is really this kind of umbrella term of discussing race and leads us to some of its offspring. One being systemic racism, which is an offspring of critical race theory. We talked about systemic racism. Black feminist thought, we haven't talked about that yet, but I believe we will. And Black feminist thought is one of the ways that it comes out of critical race theory. Well, actually, it came out of intersectionality, which is looking at, we'll talk about intersectionality more, but out of intersectionality is when you get Patricia Hill Collins' Black feminist thought. And it is Black feminist thought that is a specific theory that focuses on the unique experiences of Black women in society, and Black women throughout American history, and how Black women's experiences give us a very clear and very accurate depiction of the multiple levels of oppression that exists in U.S. society. And there are other theoretical outlooks, concepts that come out of critical race theory. Out-migration theory, that has to do with Black middle class and so many other theories, right? The myth of the model minority, so the model minority concept that has to do with the experiences of Asians and Asian Americans, particularly Asian Americans in U.S. society. So many Latino threat, we're going to talk about that. So many different ways in which you all come out of the overall umbrella term of critical race theory and looking at race in America from this critical lens. But going deeper into what Kimberly Crenshaw talks about with intersectionality, I'd like for you to click on this link. And after that, we're going to talk a little bit more about intersectionality before we close this lecture out. So intersectionality says we are going to take not only race, but other forms of identity and look at how all of these forms of identity play a role in the oppression as well as the suppression by victors and oppression towards that victim's experience. We're going to look at how all of this contributes to that, not just race. Because see, when critical race theory came out and all of the things that were written about it were kind of all from the male point of view, right? It didn't really go deeper into what women were going through in terms of race. And so what the Black women and what the women of color, early critical race theorists said was, okay, well, we keep talking about race and how it's affecting men, but what about how it's affecting women? And then we have to think deeper, not because now when we talk about women, well, what does it mean to be a woman? Are we only going to talk about women that have husbands? What about lesbian women? Right? What about women who are not a part of the United States? All right, so we have to, what about middle class women? Are we only going to talk about educated women? What about poor women, working class women, women on welfare, rich women, right? So we have to integrate all of these different ideas. And this begins to form this notion of intersectional feminism, which looks at women's identities more than just simply being women. And then it was out of that they said, well, we need to just broaden this up to just intersectionality as a whole to ensure that women are not left out of this conversation, that we include all the social identities, what your race is, what your religion is, what your class is, your education level, your ability level, nationality, sexual everything. All these identifying factors, how do they play a role in multiple levels of oppression and multiple levels of dominance? And so this is where we get intersectionality, and it is out of that we get a lot of the other theories that come under critical race theory that we talked about earlier. So, all right, sounds good. Well, hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. You can see me during my office hours. Have a great day, great week, great weekend. Make sure that you are studying and taking notes on this for any exams or assessments that are coming up. Have a great rest of your day.